First,
women get victim services, men get perpetrator services. That is what they get.
My name is Matt Orchard, and welcome to 50-50 Bias Both Ways. This is a podcast where I talk to the most controversial people I can find and then deliver two incredibly lopsided interviews back to back. The first 15 is as cordial as I can make it, and the second 15 is as contentious as humanly possible. And this week, I fucked up. So, this week we have Karen Straughan, who's a very prolific men's rights activist and anti-feminist. If you're not familiar with Karen and you want to get caught up, I recommend starting with a debate she did at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum with Naomi Wolf. It's a lot of fun. Anywho, when we got to the second half, that's supposed to be, of course, a spirited argument, the problem wasn't so much that I did poorly, which, as I said before, I mean, I'm just some dude. That's going to happen sometimes. Now, the problem, I guess, was more that I did so poorly that I think it comes across as if I'm not even trying. A few things went wrong, but I think the main thing is that although I consider myself pretty familiar with Karen's work and her stances and so forth, with the area that I decided to go into, I really did think that there was going to be significantly more daylight between us than there actually ended up being. And I was sort of caught off guard by the concessions that she was willing to make. She also brought up some things that I had never heard of before, and I think that if you listen closely to the second segment, I think you'll actually be able to hear the precise moment I really got the wind sort of taken out of my sails there. And obviously with this show, I do reserve the right to lie about what I think and play devil's advocate, of course, but again, I really wasn't expecting the conversation to pan out how it did. And all of this is not to say that it's not an interesting chat. Karen's certainly never boring, but I don't think it really lives up to the premise of the podcast. And to that end, Karen has offered to go a second round, which I do plan on taking her up on. I haven't yet tried to lock in a date for that, though, because I wanted to actually see what feedback comes in for this one and let that go toward informing how I approach the next take. So on that note, do let me know what you think on the Facebook page, which is Facebook/5050 Matt Orchard, the subreddit r/5050podcast, or the website, which is the5050podcast.blogspot.com. That's 50 with numbers, not letters, in all instances. And if you like what you hear, rate and review on iTunes to push it up the charts. In 2011, waitress, blogger, forum dweller, and mother of three, Karen Straughan decided to branch out into video blogging. She sat in her kitchen, recorded a 15-minute video, and uploaded it to YouTube with the title Feminism and the Disposable Male. That video now has 1.5 million views and her channel over 175,000 subscribers. She's very good at what she does. Without further ado, Karen Straughan. I'm joined by Karen Straughan. Karen, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, no, thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. And Karen, I'm sorry, I know that I'm probably starting this question with a question you get in at least 78% of your interviews, but could you tell us quickly about how you came to be a men's rights activist / anti-feminist, although I know it's not necessarily in that order?
Okay, well, the men's rights thing, that was, I stumbled across a men's website by accident. I'm just going to be very, very brief.
Yeah.
And I read a lot of their stuff, and it all made sense. And as somebody who has family members who have kind of been put through a legal ringer, I've had men who've experienced all kinds of these types of things in my life. I have two sons and a daughter, and I care about all of them and the world that they're going to inherit. And I felt like it was something that I needed to talk about, and I just happen to be very good at talking about it. So the actual it transitioned from just having an opinion on the internet to being something that I knew that I could do. Yeah. And make a difference. So that was the men's rights thing. The anti-feminist thing, the reason that I'm an anti-feminist is because they lie and they misrepresent things, and they tell very, very pretty lies, very lies that are very, very easy to believe. that kind of go along with our instincts. And I want to expose that so that their misrepresentations of what's really going on no longer affect public policy and no longer affect legislation. So I'm sort of aiming for everybody treated equally under the law, everybody treated as equally as possible within broader society. And I don't think feminism is the way to do that. I think that it's actually contributing in the opposite direction in a lot of ways. So that's the quick and dirty of my my decision and how I came to do this. So,
would you describe yourself as maybe a egalitarian?
No, I try not to define myself in that way simply because I don't think that men and women ever will be treated. I don't think completely equal treatment across the board is possible. I particularly don't think that women want that, or would want it if they knew what it entailed. And I am less about goals and sort of a vision of what I want society to work like. I'm more about attacking sort of the falseness of the narratives that we're working under right now, and promoting in individual cases incremental change that will help bring about a more just society, I guess. So sure. I wouldn't call myself an egalitarian. I suppose if I had to call myself something along those lines, that would be kind of it. But I'm not about goals at this point in terms of a broad view of what I think society should look like. So
okay, no, fair enough. I know we don't have a ton of time today, obviously, so we can't cover nearly close to everything. With that in mind, I mean, if you had to choose, what would be the single most important men's issue to convey to someone listening, especially if this person you're talking to is someone who's coming in with the preconception that MRA or anti-feminist means anti-woman necessarily?
Oh, geez. I think probably maybe not the most important. Well, it is really important on a number of levels, but the one that I would always lead with would be fathers' rights, and that's because it's not just about the right of a father to have some kind of relationship, meaningful relationship, and a meaningful role in their children's lives. It's also about the rights of those children to have a father in their lives, providing a stable male role model. And this particular problem leads to so many kind of secondary and tertiary issues for men and boys that I think that if we solved that, and I think it's something that everybody can really get behind. Nobody wants to see a child wrenched away from either of their parents. Yeah. Nobody wants to see a man commit suicide because he hasn't seen his kids in 2 years, and through no fault of his own, because the courts were biased against him. So you essentially have, and most people I think most people know a man who has been treated unfairly in family court or in divorce court. And so and the fallout in terms of outcomes for children, not just boys, but in particular for boys, is extremely, like you look at a 2 to 32 times higher risk of being a runaway, being in a juvenile detention facility, ending up involved in gangs or crime, doing drugs, drinking alcohol, abusing alcohol. All of these things, higher risk of suicide, a higher risk of becoming a teen parent, a higher risk of dropping out of school, or of never attending college, being kicked out of school. All of these things are the fallout from fatherlessness. And these are things that are impacting children. And I would hope that because of that, we would be able to look beyond our natural distrust of men in general. At least we have a distrust of men in general compared to what we feel about women, and look at the impacts on children of our policy decisions and our legal decisions in terms of custody and things like that, and really focus on trying to find holistic solutions and resolve a lot of these problems just by dealing with fathers' rights. So.
And I think you're right that it is a really compelling issue for the men's rights movement in terms of something that resonates with a lot of people who aren't necessarily a part of that scene. I watched the Red Pill a couple of months ago, which I know you appeared in, and they say it had some absolute horror stories about what some men go through in family courts, and I mean, in some instances being extorted. I mean, it's a horror show.
It can be. It absolutely can be. And we tend to. It's almost like the moment a woman says, I and my children are in danger from this man. We are so willing to take her word for that due process goes out the window. And what tends to happen in those cases is that it takes so long to resolve. If the man is innocent, he has done nothing wrong, it takes so long to resolve that the judge will say the children are now settled in their new situation. And to change that would actually be a disruption in their lives. And so we're going to keep things, in this way. We're going to keep the mom having sole custody, regardless of the fact that she lied, regardless of the fact we're not going to penalize her in any way, because then the children would suffer. And this man is still now doing supervised visitation once a month or something like that, even though he did nothing wrong. And even though he's been exonerated within the confines of the family court. And it's extremely difficult to actually get any penalties on women who deliberately abuse the process and deliberately abuse these protections, because a lot of what occurs in family court is privileged, so it cannot be transferred to another court. You can't charge a woman who lied to a family court judge of perjury in a criminal court, and you can't sue her in a civil court for her misstatements and her misrepresentation. So you're essentially stuck with this situation where the judge says, well, okay, these kids are comfortable now with just their mom, and maybe she spent a year poisoning their feelings and their attitude toward their father and telling them that he's a monster. And so it would be cruel to subject the children to more visitation with their dad. And so it really is this way for women to get an upper hand. Not all women do this, but because it is so easily done, and because family court lawyers will actually recommend to their clients, oftentimes their female clients, to go get a protection order, and then you'll have a leg up in the negotiations. You essentially have this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of men who are ripped apart from their families, and then judges don't want to reunite these fathers with their children because it would upset the children now, because they're so used to the new normal, right? So, yeah, it's extremely difficult to uproot.
If we're talking about some of the lack of due process in family courts and how unbalanced it can be toward men, it's probably a good transition to other issues in the wider court system, where in a lot of cases, I guess, men don't necessarily get due process when it comes to, because you're talking about accusations in family court. I mean,
yes.
I'll let you interpret that how you like, because there's actually quite a few different things you could talk about there, but I mean, what jumps out at you?
Oh, well, I mean, due process right now in Canada is under extreme scrutiny as far as, do we really need it in specific cases. We just had Bill C-51 just passed its second reading in Parliament. It's gone to committee. It will be voted on and maybe adopted. And the proponents of this bill openly state that they are attempting. It will encode certain changes to sexual assault law in Canada. And sexual assault law is, you can even go in and read judges' decisions. You can read all of the public debate on it. It is really, regardless of the fact that it's gender neutral in the statutes and everything, it is really aimed at protecting women from sexually predatory men. That's the only reason it exists. That is the entire purpose. That is the reason behind these amendments, is to make it easier to convict men of sexual assault when they sexually assault women, and make it easier on women victims. This is 100% all of the debate, the entirety of the debate is about male rapists and female victims. And they will openly state that this bill is an attempt to eliminate every single possible defense that a man could raise in order to raise reasonable doubt in a sexual assault case, that it is there to prevent certain forms of evidence, like maybe she texted him before the alleged assault that, come on over and let's have some fun, and then texted him afterwards, that was great, let's do it again, to subject those to rape shield tests, to make them potentially inadmissible because they would make her seem less worthy of belief or make her seem more likely to have consented. Those types of texts will now become part of her sexual history.
To me, yeah.
Right. So I mean, they're really trying to use statutory and procedural measures in order to roadblock a man from raising any kind of defense whatsoever. And so essentially, I mean, what they're aiming for is a 100% conviction rate in sexual assault cases, absolutely 100%. And they will bend the ideas of due process of law. They will bend the idea of being able to confront your accuser. They will twist the idea of probable cause and all of those things, the public interest, everything, in order to get there.
Talking about it, you reminded me of the Gian Gomeshi case, which I've seen you talk about before, and that was just one that if I hadn't seen your video or I hadn't seen, is it Catherine Butchard? Is that her name?
I'm not. Christy Blatchford?
Christy Blatchford, yeah. If I hadn't seen her coverage or yours, I honestly wouldn't have known some of the details of that case, which were pretty shocking. But if you look at the general wider media coverage, you just wouldn't know how much evidence was going in his favour with that one. It was shocking.
Oh, well, the media did such a poor job of reporting on that particular case that I have talked to innumerable people who believe that not only did Gian Gomeshi get off on a technicality, which he did not, but that he was actually, the thing that he got away with was rape, when there's no indication that he ever had sex with any of the complainants. Yes, it was a sexual assault trial, but he never actually had sexual intercourse, what anybody would consider to be rape, with any of the complainants. And so this is the impression that the public has, because the reporting on that trial was so absolutely shoddy. And you actually have to go in and you have to read the transcripts, the hundreds of pages of testimony and the judge's decision in full and all of these things, the closing arguments of both sides, in order to actually get a real view of why he was acquitted. Because to listen to the press, he just got away with it. He was a rapist who got away with it, even though he wasn't even being tried for rape, and all the evidence showed that the complainants were lying. So,
and if there are any listeners who are hearing about that and think this sounds like apology or what have you for your rape apology or anything, just do look up the Gian Gomeshi case, the facts of it, because I mean I do agree with you, Karen. It's just kind of beyond belief how much of that seems to be willfully ignored in press coverage. And sorry, I think I've sort of spent your last minutes of the softball talking there. Is there anything else you want to quickly cover in terms of anything we've talked about before we move on to the next?
No, you go ahead and lob some hardballs at me. It's all good.
All right, thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. Well, okay, so with the sort of general MRA talking points, the one thing I wanted to start with, because I guess the one talking point I can never quite get on board with is domestic violence. So even if women are more prone to resort to hitting their partners, it's a matter of degree, in my opinion. So we could swap data and surveys and studies all day, but you're just never going to see as many men wind up in emergency rooms or morgues, for that matter, from domestic violence as you are women. And I think that is a pretty fair explanation for why we as a society put more of an emphasis towards male on female violence. I can understand why there's an imbalance there in focus, if you understand what I mean.
Oh, I can understand why there's an imbalance there, but that doesn't necessarily, if 20, and for every 40 women who need medical attention from their injuries from domestic violence, about 25 men do, right? And yes, that does mean that women are the majority of, the victims who are severely injured, and they are absolutely the majority of those who say that they are in fear, regardless of their level of actual liability. Women are more likely to be afraid of just about anything than men are. And that's not necessarily indicative of, like I said, their level of actual liability, their level of actual risk. But it does not, that disparity does not justify, and it cannot justify, a 100% allocation of resources to female victims and male perpetrators. It cannot justify that the only services available to men are batterer treatment programs, and all of the battered domestic violence shelters and services for victims go to female victims, and that even including 14-year-old boys whose mothers have to find other arrangements for them because they're not allowed to bring them into the shelter when their husbands are abusive. I mean, sorry.
Sorry, did you say that if a woman flees to a women's refuge shelter with her children, the boys aren't allowed in? What are you saying there?
In many cases in the UK and Canada, boys over a certain age will not be allowed into the shelter.
What kind of age are we talking?
In some cases, it's 10 or 12. In some cases, it's 14.
Okay, I need to look into that. I mean, if that is true, this is the hardball section. But if you make a point, you make a point. With the resources, sorry. If a man's assaulted by his wife, it's another thing I wanted to follow up on. Let's say she's been hit with a pan or something, because I know you can sustain injuries if you're a man in domestic abuse. Obviously, I get that refuge shelters are pretty much 100% women. I accept that, but you said something about treatment there. I didn't quite understand. I mean, you can still get treatment for that.
Oh, well, no, you can get treatment as a man, as a batterer who's trying to rehabilitate himself, trying to not be a batterer anymore. Those are the treatment options available. In fact, in one state in the U.S., I believe someone is bringing a lawsuit because batterer treatment programs are paid for by the government, as are domestic violence shelters. But when you have same-sex relationships between women and one of the women is battering the other, she has to pay for her batterer treatment because the government doesn't pay for it, because they don't see it. I guess the government doesn't see it as a problem when women batter other women even. So, there is a bifurcated allocation of resources between men and women. Women get victim services, men get perpetrator services. That is what they get. In some states, there has been some progress made at the hands of men's rights groups. In California, for instance, now since Mark Angelucci's NCFM, National Coalition for Men lawsuit against the California network of battered women's shelters, now domestic violence shelters who, when men seek help there, they have to provide them some referral services to legal assistance, and they have to provide them with hotel vouchers. And when you're talking about a situation, let's picture a situation between a man and a woman, and they have children, and the woman is the violent party and the man is nonviolent. Okay, what are his options? Okay, he calls the police. Well, there's all kinds of research indicating that he's more likely to be arrested than helped in that situation. He's more likely to be removed from the home, even if it's just for one night, than the woman is. And that he is many, many, many times more likely to be arrested than she is. So you have her acting out violently. You have him, if he calls police for help, he is most likely to be removed from the home. Right now, where are his kids at this point? They are in the sole care and custody of a violent woman. Okay, so what are his options realistically? And it's not necessarily about providing him with a free place to stay or whatever. What are his options when he decides to leave that relationship, right? He's decided he has had enough of the abuse. Does he leave his children in the sole care and custody of a violent woman? Does he take his children with him? Okay, at which point he is guilty in the de facto sense of custodial interference and kidnapping, because there is no one in government who is in a position to legitimate his decision to remove his children from that environment. Not the police, not a domestic violence shelter, not a referral service, not a hotline, nothing. Okay, not an agency, nothing. Nobody who has been gifted authority by the government to legitimate his decision to remove his children from that environment. Or does he stay and act as a human shield between this violent woman and his children? Those are his three choices. Or, okay, he could leave without his kids, in which case, he's legally abandoned them and he's just put the kibosh on any kind of seeking custody of them, because that's going to hurt him in a custody case. You legally abandoned your children, right? So now he's a leg down in a custody case. So I'm not even arguing, because I don't think that men need as many domestic violence shelters as women do. Okay. Because you're right, you're absolutely right in a lot of ways. That's not as big a necessity. But what they do really need is some kind of means of legitimating their decision to leave with their children.
Legal recourse, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I get that, and that's fair. But I'll move on to something then a little more controversial from you. We'll see if we can make something stick to you, Karen, okay? So this is something, you'll know about this because this is sort of circulated as a bit of a macro of you. And I apologize because I couldn't find the original source, but I know that you've talked about it in a blog post back in 2012, a while ago. So I know you're aware of this quote. So here it is. I used to live under a young couple with a baby. I'd listen as she followed him from room to room upstairs, stomping, slamming things, throwing things, screaming. After about an hour, he'd eventually hit her, and everything would go quiet. An hour after that, they'd be out with the baby in the stroller, looking perfectly content with each other. Erin Pitsey called it consensual violence, and said in the main, that was the type she'd see at her shelter. It is also the type that results in the most severe injuries in women. Surprise, surprise, likely because of our never ever hit a woman mentality, has those men waiting until they completely lose control of their emotions before giving their woman what they're demanding. So reading that quote, Karen, am I reading that correctly, that you're essentially saying even the most severely beaten women are essentially bringing it on themselves in most cases?
No, because in that particular case, if you look at my recounting of that particular case, she was actually being horrifically violent with him. And from the noises, she wasn't throwing small things. She wasn't throwing boxes of Kleenexes at him. And he would hit her one time. That's not a severe, that is a severely violent woman, right? Who was hit once. She was not brutally beaten. She wasn't beaten up. She wasn't, and she was not living in fear of him. None of my interactions with them, none of my observations of them ever gave me the slightest inclination, the slightest hint that she was scared of him. If anything, he was scared of her. And if, going by my memory, which I didn't include in that comment because I was writing I was in a rush and I was in what I perceived to be a friendly space.
Okay, yep.
Where people would interpret my comment charitably. Basically what she would do is he would be walking from room to room, closing the door, begging her through the door, please just stop. Let's talk about this later. Let's deal with this later. And he was repeatedly trying to leave the situation, but they have a small baby. Yeah. Right? So is he going to leave the house? No.
No. Okay. No, I understand that situation. And I'll give you leeway here as well, because as you say, if you're writing it on a forum or whatever and it was quick, maybe you didn't write it, as you say, perfectly. But you said just at the start of that when you were explaining, and I think that's a fair clarification from you there in regards to that specific anecdote. But you said that you were talking about this woman throwing things at him, being extremely violent and everything. When I asked if you were essentially saying that most beaten women are bringing it on themselves, the reason I'm asking that is that after you give the anecdote, you do then broaden out that anecdote to talk about how the type of injuries.
It does say that when men are trained to never hit, right? Okay, so if we're going to look at things in an honest way and say what this woman needed or wanted from him was for him to put his foot down, right? Not to beg to talk about it later, not to beg her forgiveness, not to apologize for whatever tiny little thing he did wrong or whatever had sent her into this kind of rage, but to put his foot down and say, I'm not going to be treated this way, right? If he's waiting and waiting and waiting to do that, because it's never okay. It's not okay to yell at a woman. It's not okay to ever slap a woman. It's not okay to restrain a woman. It's not okay to take her by the shoulders and say, stop it. It's not okay to do anything, ever lay your hands on a woman, ever be mean to a woman, right? And boys are trained to do this from the time that they're very young. And, it's never okay to be mean to a girl. Now, once they get to the point where they can no longer contain all that, that is the point where they have lost control of their emotions. And that is the point where women are going to be the most hurt, because the man has lost control. He's lost self-control, right? If the only way he's ever going to actually put his foot down in that way, in a way that he's been programmed not to all his life, never be mean, never put your hands on her, never, nothing. Don't even defend yourself. It's not okay, right? If the only time he's going to do that is when he's completely lost control of himself, well, then he's completely lost control of himself, and you're going to find more serious injuries. And surprise, surprise, that's what the data indicates, is that it's when men are hitting them back that women are most likely to be injured.
So, are you saying that the sort of situation you're describing of being heavily provoked is the cause of most severe injuries?
Not most severe injuries, but it is, you have a higher likelihood of severe injury in those cases. And it may sound counterintuitive, but that domestic violence that we see in movies and on the Lifetime channel and everything, movies like Sleeping with the Enemy and Enough, that sort of unilateral violence against a nonviolent partner, in both cases of a unilaterally violent female or male partner, in both cases, those are associated with the lowest risk of serious injury. It is when two people are beating on each other in whatever context that people in general, men and women, are most likely to be seriously injured. And unfortunately for women, because they initiate violence more often and because men are physically stronger, they're going to sustain the more serious injuries.
Where does the stat that women initiate it more often come from, by the way? Is that something that's universally found in studies, or is that...
Well, there was different studies. They will vary. They will vary in the proportion and things like that. Most studies find relative gender symmetry. But the one that I go with for the most part these days is the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Project, which is it's actually 17 different meta-analyses of 100 studies each that find that in unilaterally violent relationships, women are the aggressor 70% of the time. So in those cases of, one partner beating on the other for burning the toast, in 70% of those cases, that's going to be a woman beating on a man rather than the other way around. And that women initiate in reciprocally violent relationships, women initiate the violence 50 to 70% of the time. So you're looking at something, and this is, and like, I believe all of this is a problem. I believe that if you're a kid, if you're seeing, it doesn't really matter whether you're seeing mom beating on dad or dad beating on mom. What you're learning is that there's no security to be found from your parents, because there is always this knife edge of, is mom or dad going to be seriously hurt or killed or gone tomorrow? So there's no security for that child. And they are also learning that violence is the way to settle conflict, right? No matter who's beating on whom, right? So this is no way to exist as a child in this circumstance. And number two, to look at the entire problem as one caused by patriarchy and male patriarchal notions of masculinity and the subordination of women, when in so many of these cases you really have women who are not living in fear of their male partners. They're the ones initiating the violence. It's not self-defensive. In their own words, it's not self-defensive. They say they're lashing out because they feel like he's not listening, or he's not doing what they want them to, or they're jealous of the fact that he talked to that pretty cashier, or they want to control him, right, and control his behavior. And so they're expressing all the exact same reasons for being violent in mostly similar proportions that men do when they're violent with their partners. And so looking at it through this gendered lens, this feminist lens, is not doing anybody any good. It's not ending the violence. It's not ending the cycle of violence, the generational cycle of violence. It's not helping those kids. And all it's doing is imposing a certain set of parameters on men and a certain set of parameters on women based solely on their sex.
Well, Karen, we're out of time for the format, but I've got to say honestly, I think I kind of fucked up. I just kind of got so interested in what you're talking about, I didn't really jump down your throat all that much. But
if you wanna call me back sometime and hardball me again, I'm totally fine with that.
Okay. Well, look, I really do again appreciate you making the time, and someone gave me feedback last week. They said they wanted to see what guests thought of the experience. Again, I don't know if I actually really did with you what I did with Robert Spencer, which I know you listened to, but
yeah.
How did you find that? Did you find I was at all critical in the second half, or did I kind of fall there?
Oh, you raised some objections, but I'm so used to those objections that that it's fairly easy for me to anticipate them, and my position is one where, yes, I understand why people would be put off with that comment of mine, put off by it, but I'm going to explain what my intention was with that comment and why I feel that way, and and hopefully I'm persuasive in explaining that. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if I'm a total convert yet. I need to look at the studies and everything, but I understand what you're saying, and I don't think that you're as unreasonable maybe as a lot of your opponents make out, Karen. So,
thanks.